Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rosemary Holt, and on behalf of the Catholic Information Center and our director, Father Charles Chulos, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone who is with us tonight in person and online, and to introduce our good friend Ryan T. Anderson, author of When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Ryan holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton University and a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. He is currently the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and the founder and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. He is author or co-author of numerous bestsellers, including Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, and Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination, among others. He is a fellow of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and a visiting fellow at the Veritas Center at Franciscan University. 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices have cited Ryan's research, and he has made appearances on ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policies, the Weekly Standards, and many others. Tonight, Ryan will lead us in a discussion on his new book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment, and offer thoughtful answers to questions such as, can a boy truly be trapped in a girl's body? Can modern medicine really reassign sex? What's the loving response to a friend or child experiencing a gender identity conflict? And what should our laws say on these issues? And with that, please join me in welcoming our friend Ryan T. Anderson.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Rosemary for putting this all together and for the CIC for hosting it. And let me pick up right where Rosemary left off. Is it true that a boy can be trapped in a girl's body? Is our sex merely assigned to us at birth? Can modern medicine reassign sex? To a certain extent, these shouldn't be difficult questions. Back in the 1970s, Dr. Paul McHugh thought he had convinced the vast majority of his professional colleagues not to go along with radical claims that were being made about the human person and the human body back then. McHugh had been an undergraduate at Harvard College. He then went to Harvard Medical School. In the 70s, he was appointed psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital and chair of the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins Medical School. And that was when, back in '79, he shut down Hopkins' then new sex reassignment clinic. Hopkins had been a pioneer in this type of medicine. They opened their clinic back in the 60s. And when McHugh assumed responsibility for all psychiatric medicine in the 70s, he asked one of his colleagues to do a study of what had been the long-term outcomes of the patients who had had their sex surgically reassigned. The results weren't very reassuring, and the clinic remained shut down from 1979 up until last year when Hopkins reopened it. Not in light of new evidence, but in light of new ideology. And now the people who are increasingly in the spotlight of this transgender moment are children. A decade ago, Boston Children's Hospital became, as its website brags, quote, the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents. Today, so a decade later, more than 45 pediatric gender clinics have opened their doors. Parents are told that puberty-blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their child from committing suicide. Never mind that the best studies on gender dysphoria show that somewhere between 80 to 95% of children will naturally grow out of any gender identity conflicted stage, and they'll naturally resolve their identity with their body. And unfortunately, the statistics show that transitioning procedures don't provide the long-term happiness and wholeness that people are seeking. People who identify as transgender, 41% of them will attempt suicide at some point in their lives. And people who have had the reassignment surgery are 19 times more likely than average to die by suicide. Those statistics should stop us in our tracks. They should be more than enough to halt the headlong rush into promoting transgender identities and transition therapies, especially for children. And so what I argue in this book is that Dr. McHugh got it right back in the 70s, and that human nature hasn't changed in the past 40 years. That the best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality and of gender as a social manifestation of sex. And so what I do in the book, and what I'll touch on a little bit tonight, we won't have time to go through all of it, but what I do in the book is I try to offer a nuanced vision of human embodiment, a balanced approach to some of the public policy and legal questions, and then also a sober and honest survey of the human costs of getting human nature wrong. So let me start. I'm going to start by first reporting what activists are claiming about the nature of the human person and the human body. So I just want to start by bringing everyone up to speed on what's being promoted out there. Because people say we live in a postmodern age that has rejected metaphysics. But that's not quite true. We live in a postmodern age that promotes an alternative metaphysic. And so at the heart of our transgender moment are radical claims about the human person. This is something that John Paul II picked up on half a century ago when he said the crisis of the 20th century was a crisis of faulty anthropology, faulty visions of the human person. And that's what's taking place today. It's not that we've rejected metaphysics, that we're offering an alternative metaphysics. But what's interesting here is that people don't want to make these arguments based upon how someone identifies. They want to make the argument about who someone is. Right? Because obviously an argument about who someone is would be much stronger than an argument about how someone identifies. But they don't want to acknowledge that this is an argument based on philosophy and metaphysics. They want to claim the mantle of science and medicine because in our culture, the scientists and the doctors are the high priests. And so they want to mask what ultimately are philosophical claims in the language of science. Let me immediately make a kind of a caution here. Throughout this, when I'm talking about the claims that are being made, I'm talking about the claims being made by activists. And it's important that we distinguish between transgender activists and ordinary Americans who might identify as transgender, ordinary Americans who might experience gender dysphoria. The vast majority of people who are transgender or who experience gender dysphoria aren't activists of any sorts. And that's not who I'm addressing in this part of the lecture or in the book. I'm addressing the activists who are actively promoting a transgender ideology, radical claims about the nature of reality. So if we can bring up the first slide, let me show you a quote from Dr. Deanna Atkins, professor at Duke University School of Medicine and the director of the Duke Center for Child and Adolescent Gender Care, which opened in 2015, which gives you an idea of how new these clinics are that are focusing on children and how radical some of the claims are. This is a quote from an expert declaration that Dr. Atkins made to a federal court during the litigation surrounding HB2. She says, quote, "From a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for purposes of classifying someone as male or female." Now, those are remarkable claims for several reasons. The first is that historically, a generation ago, when the word gender was first created to be applied to people rather than just to grammar, it was being used in contradistinction to sex. The original thinkers who developed the idea of gender as applied to people were saying gender is a social construct and sex is merely a biological factor. Now we're being told that our gender identity is the determinant of sex. So we've turned that argument within one generation entirely upside down. A generation ago, chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics were the bread and butter of medical science. And now today, for political purposes, we have a med school professor telling a federal court that it's counter to medical science to rely on any of those aspects of the human person. Now, it's not enough that these claims are being made in courtrooms across the nation. They're also being made in classrooms, and they're being made in classrooms of children who are much too young to even have an understanding of these things. So let me show the next slide, which is of the gender-bred person. It's meant to be attractive. It's meant to look like a genderbread man. It's meant to be something that kindergartners and grade school students could identify with. And it's meant to catechize your children and your grandchildren. The catechism is not the Baltimore Catechism. It's not the Westminster Catechism. It's the genderbread person. And as you can see here, it says that we have 5 different aspects to our sexual identity. At the top in the brain, there's gender identity, which it defines as, quote, how you in your head define your gender, based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. And then in the upper right-hand corner, it lists, quote, 4 of infinite possibilities: womanness, manness, true spirit, and genderqueer. And then right below it, you have gender expression, and you'll see on the graphic, this encompasses the entire genderbread person. They define gender expression as, quote, the way you present gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. And the options it lists are feminine or masculine, butch or femme, androgynous, or gender neutral. Then it has biological sex, femaleness to maleness, not male or female, but femaleness to maleness. And then it has 2 components at the bottom for sexual orientation: sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to. And so young children are being taught that they have to identify their own identity on 4 of those spectrums: their gender identity, their gender expression, their sexual attraction, and their romantic attraction. And it need have nothing to do with their biological sex. Just the mere fact that they're a boy or a girl or a man or a woman has no bearing on their gender identity, their gender expression, their romantic attractions, their sexual attractions. Now, the genderbread person got in trouble. The genderbread person got in trouble because even though this is version 3.3, this is the most up-to-date, cutting edge of politically correct science on these issues, the genderbread person got in trouble because he looks too much like a man. And so even the most up-to-date iteration of politically correct ideology fell prey to the patriarchy. And then second, it says biological sex, and it locates it right in the pelvic area. So they created a new graphic, and if we can go to the next slide, you'll see the gender unicorn. And this is intentional. It looks like a Barney. It looks like Barney. It's meant to be attractive and appealing to young kids. It's no surprise that it's a mythical creature. And you'll now see that whereas we once had biological sex, we now have the most up-to-date politically correct language of sex assigned at birth. Rather than having a bodily reality of male or female, it's now something that was merely assigned to you, and therefore can be reassigned, because perhaps it was misassigned to begin with. This is the ideology that's being promoted, and that's why I want to draw that distinction between people who experience gender dysphoria versus the people who are actively promoting this vision of the human person. Because for someone who does experience gender dysphoria, how they interpret their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own experiences will depend upon what background assumptions they're making. If you experience gender dysphoria and this is your background assumption about the nature of reality and the nature of the human person, you're much more likely to interpret your feelings of gender dysphoria to mean that you're actually the opposite sex. Conversely, if you understand the options here, I don't feel comfortable in my body, but I know I can't be the opposite sex, you might be more inclined to pursue a therapeutic approach that'll help you feel comfortable in your body. So the underlying ideology matters partly because that's how children will be interpreting their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Now, if you wonder why is it the case that we now have sex assigned at birth and why gender identity is now the preferred determinant of sex, the Trans Students Educational Resources, TSER, the people who made this graphic explain. So in the next slide, you'll see that they explain, quote, biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning. Besides that, it is related to some sex characteristics. It is also harmful to trans people. Instead, we prefer sex assigned at birth, which provides a more accurate description of what biological sex may be trying to communicate. Now, from the transgender ontology, the transgender worldview of the human person, that gives rise to the transgender medical protocols. And I want to go through the 4-part standard of care that's been promulgated by the transgender health experts, specifically for children that experience gender dysphoria. And so the first step in this 4-part standard of care is social transition. So a child as young as 2 or 3 years old should be allowed to dress as the opposite sex, should be referred to by a new name and a new pronoun, should have access to new sex-specific facilities, new bathrooms, new locker rooms. The social transition can happen for children as young as 2 or 3. That's the first step. The only diagnostic criterion is that the child be persistent, insistent, and consistent in their transgender identity. If the child's insistent, persistent, and consistent about it, that means your child is transgender and therefore you should let them socially transition. The second step is that as your child approaches puberty, you should place your child on puberty-blocking drugs to prevent your child from going through puberty in the, quote, wrong body. So if gender identity is the determinant of sex, if you're really a girl trapped in a boy's body, they have to prevent you from going through male puberty. And so they use a drug that's FDA approved for a condition known as precocious puberty, the early onset of puberty, which delays puberty to an age-appropriate time. They're using this drug off-label to indefinitely delay puberty, to block it entirely. Which then leads to the third step in the protocol, because now you have a 14, 15, 16-year-old child who hasn't matured. Their puberty's been delayed and all of their classmates have matured. So the third step is the administration of cross-sex hormones. Testosterone therapy for girls, estrogen therapy for boys, to mimic the pubertal development of their gender identity, to masculinize the girl's body, to feminize the boy's body. And then the fourth step, at age 18, these people can receive sex reassignment surgeries. Top surgery and or bottom surgery, the removal of their secondary sex characteristics, their external genitalia, their internal reproductive organs, and then the cosmetic surgery to try to create something that resembles the opposite sex. The book goes into an appropriate amount of detail. We don't have time tonight. Needless to say, there are limits to what modern science and modern medicine can do. Now, if you don't believe me in terms of some of the children transitioning at young ages, the social transition, on the next slide you'll see another expert declaration from that same federal court in North Carolina. Peer-reviewed research demonstrates that pre-pubertal children asserting a different gender identity from the one they were assigned at birth are cognitively capable enough to be aware of the gender they are asserting. The meaning of a child's gender identity assertion at a younger age is no less valid than the meaning of a gender identity assertion of an older child. So the idea here is that a 5-year-old boy can really know what it means to be a girl and can really know that they're a girl trapped in a boy's body. And the 5-year-old who asserts this, that should be taken no less seriously than the 15-year-old or the 50-year-old. That we're each in the best place to know our own gender identity, even though the 5-year-old boy may have very limited experience of what it means to be a boy or a girl. That's the declaration based on, of course, peer-reviewed research. The next slide, just to give you another quote, this comes from a handbook that was created by PFLAG. It's an acronym that used to stand for Parents, Friends, and Family of Lesbians and Gays. That left the T and the transgender out, so they no longer go by anything other than the acronym. So it's an acronym that doesn't stand for anything, which again shows you how quickly things are moving. That even some of the LGB activist groups weren't quite with it on the T and had to play catch up. And the argument here is that, quote, children know a lot about themselves and their gender from a very early age. And whether they reveal themselves to be gender expansive, transgender, or eventually neither, the most important thing we can do is listen to what our children are telling us and really hear them. So rather than helping your child develop a more robust understanding of sex and of gender, we're supposed to listen to what our children are telling us and hear them. And by hear them, they mean accept what they're saying at face value. Rather than saying, you know, boys can play with dolls, that doesn't mean you're a girl. Rather than helping them have a more robust and capacious understanding of their gender identity, we're supposed to listen to them and, quote, really hear them. In the next slide, you'll see a quote from a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and at their Children's Hospital, their Center for Child and Adolescent Gender Care, which is also one of those newly created clinics. Like left-handed people, our young transgender people are only a small minority of the general population. And like left-handed people, they're a variation of human development that is to be celebrated and honored rather than punished or denied, as if those are the only two options. And they are our best teachers in alerting us to the reality that gender exists primarily between our ears and our brains and minds, and not necessarily by what is between our legs, our genitalia, or our company XX and XY chromosomes, as many are mistakenly prone to believe. We demonstrate how much we have yet to learn when we say, but honey, you can't be a girl, you're a boy because you have a penis. Boys have penises and girls have vaginas. And then she continues in the next slide. They refuse to pin themselves down as either male or female. Maybe they are a boy-girl, or a gender hybrid, or gender ambidextrous, moving freely between genders, living somewhere in between, or creating their own mosaic of gender identity and expression. As they grow older, they might identify themselves as agender, or gender neutral, or gender queer. Each one of these children is exercising their gender creativity, and we can think of them as our gender creative children. That's the worldview that's inspiring these medical treatments. So when you hear, oh, the expert at the University of California in San Francisco says it's perfectly fine to block puberty and to give boys estrogen and give girls testosterone, this is what it's based on. It's this understanding of the nature of reality and the reality of the human person. So from the transgender worldview comes the transgender medicine, comes the transgender public policy. And so I just want to run through 4 minor points so then we can keep moving. But the points are, one, there are lessons that children will be taught. Whether or not your kids and grandkids will be indoctrinated with the gender unicorn. Right? So one thing is, what will young people be taught about their own identities? The second is access to sex-specific facilities. Are we going to do bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams based on biology or based on gender identity? The third are prohibitions for, quote, misgendering people. In New York City, you can be fined $250,000 if you intentionally use the wrong pronouns. So there will be speech codes about what you can and cannot say. And then lastly, the provision of desired medical services. And this comes in 2 parts. One, will bad medicine be required? So will healthcare plans be forced to cover sex reassignment therapies? Will doctors be forced to perform them? And then 2, will good medicine be prohibited? And what I'll mention there is that in 7 states, a medical professional can lose his or her medical license if they were to talk with a child about why they think they're the opposite sex and try to help them identify with their own bodies. 7 states have passed legislation to make that an unlawful practice of medicine, where the physician can lose his or her medical license. But in all 50 states, if you're a physician who helps a boy transition into living as a girl, or a girl transition into living as a boy, that's not prohibited. And under Obamacare, there was a mandate that would have required all healthcare plans to cover transition therapies and all relevant physicians to perform them. If we have time at the end, I'll come back to that. If we can skip 2 slides ahead. So this is Schools in Transition, a guide for supporting transgender students. It's produced by the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, Gender Spectrum, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the United States. So the largest teachers union has partnered with all of these LGBT activist groups and with the ACLU to produce school guidance. And the gist, we skipped one that went into more detail, but the gist is that ultimately the school environment must be set up so transgender girls are treated like all other girls and transgender boys like all other boys. A transgender girl is a boy who identifies as a girl. And so when they say it has to be set up so they're treated like all other girls, that means that boy who identifies as a girl needs to have unfettered access to the girls' bathrooms, the girls' locker rooms, the girls' sports teams, dorm rooms, hotel rooms for overnight field trips and athletic competitions. That's what they're getting at. And then in the next slide from this same publication, privacy and confidentiality are critically important for transgender students who do not have supportive families. In those situations, even inadvertent disclosures could put the student in a potentially dangerous situation at home, so it's important to have a plan in place to help avoid any mistakes or slip-ups. What they're talking about here are guidelines for schools on how to allow students to transition without their parents knowing about it. And there's an entire checklist on how teachers and principals can allow students to transition at school by having a separate wardrobe waiting for them in the principal's office. They're dropped off at school at 8 a.m. They can go to the principal's office, change clothes, spend the rest of the day being referred to as the opposite sex, go back to the principal's office at 4, change back into the original clothes, and then go home. Parents will never know. Checklist, this is what they mean by inadvertent disclosures, to make sure that inside of the school the child's referred to by the new name, but in communication to the parents, the child's referred to by the given name. So parental authority is entirely being sidestepped. And unfortunately, just a week and a half ago now, parents lost custody of their daughter in Cincinnati because the daughter wants to transition to be a boy, and the parents wanted to wait and to get her therapeutic care to identify as a girl rather than a testosterone therapy. And so we're going to see more and more cases like this, unfortunately, in the years to come. I won't go through it tonight in any detail just because of time, but in the book I go through some of what I've called the philosophical contradictions of the transgender worldview. The idea that they're asserting two things simultaneously that are mutually contradictory. And so I'll just run through a couple of the examples. The transgender worldview, it relies on a new form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism, in which the human person is something other than the physical body, while simultaneously embracing materialism, in which only physical bodies exist. So simultaneously, we're not the physical body, but only physical bodies exist. It insists, quote, that gender exists between our ears, in our brains and minds, and yet it says that modern medicine has to reassign our bodies to accord to our gender. If gender is primarily between our minds, why can't I live out my gender in the body I have? Why do we have to transform my body if gender is primarily between the ears and, quote, not necessarily what's between our legs? The transgender worldview, it relies on rigid sex stereotypes in which boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls, and yet it insists that gender is purely a social construct, and so there are no meaningful distinctions between men and women, and yet gender identity is real and meaningful, while the facts of human embodiment are not. And then lastly, it embraces a radical expressive individualism, where people should be free to do what they want to do, to define the truth how they wish it to be, and yet it enforces a ruthless paternalism, in which anyone who dares to dissent from this worldview will be silenced, coerced, or penalized. So let me pivot now to talk about some of the outcomes. And I want to start with the physical outcomes. Contrary to the claims of the activists, sex isn't assigned at birth, and as a result, it can't be reassigned. Sex is a bodily reality that can be recognized long before birth. You can recognize it on an ultrasound image. And it's based upon the organization of the organism with respect to sexual reproduction. This is how we define sex across the animal kingdom. We look at how is the organism organized with respect to sexual reproduction to determine the sex of that organism. Is it a male or a female? There are two different sexual reproductive systems, a male and a female system, based upon two different compositions of sex chromosomes, XX and XY, where the Y chromosome is functioning and where the body can receive and absorb androgens. If those two factors hold, you have an XY composition of chromosomes with a functioning Y chromosome with the ability to absorb androgens, you will develop as a male. If not, you will develop as a female. That's how we look at and how we determine and define males and females of the species. So modern science shows that this starts in our chromosomes and then proceeds with our development as embryos, with the reproductive organs that are produced, with the reproductive hormones, the sex hormones that are produced, with the external genitalia that are developed. These are bodily realities that goes through every cellular molecular system, every organ in our bodies, stamped male or female. This is so much the case that the FDA and this CDC now require, or the NHS, let me get my acronyms right, National Institute for Health and FDA require pharmaceutical companies to now run tests on both males and females. Because what they noticed was that disease impacts men and women differently, and medicine impacts men and women differently. So if you only test new drugs on male bodies, you're not actually learning how disease impacts women. If you only know the appropriate dosage of your medicine on male bodies, you don't know appropriate dosages for women, or how these drugs might impact women in ways that they don't impact men. So the FDA now requires testing of both men and women precisely because there are differences. And they don't require it based on gender identity. So contrary to what the doctor from Duke might suggest, it's not counter to medical science to rely on chromosomes and hormones and internal reproductive organs and external genitalia and secondary sex characteristics. Those are the things that would make the bodies different, which would make the expression of diseases and then the impact of drugs different. So as a result, you can't reassign these realities. What you can do is you can change some of the external manifestations of our sex identity. You can masculinize or feminize these bodies. So in the next slide, from Professor Larry Mayer, a scholar in psychiatry at Hopkins and then a professor of statistics and biostatistics at Arizona State. Scientifically speaking, transgender men are not biological men, and transgender women are not biological women. The claims to the contrary are not supported by a scintilla of scientific evidence. And then in the next slide, Robert George, professor of jurisprudence at Princeton, changing sexes is a metaphysical impossibility because it is a biological impossibility. So those are some of the physical outcomes. What are some of the psychosocial outcomes? And here, sadly, just as sex reassignment fails to reassign sex biologically speaking, it also fails to bring the wholeness that people are frequently seeking psychologically. The medical evidence suggests that it does not adequately address the underlying psychosocial problems suffered by people who identify as transgender. And even when the procedure is a success as a technical and cosmetic matter, even in societies that are relatively trans-friendly and devoid of stigma, people still face poor outcomes. And so in the next slide, this is from Dr. McHugh, University Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry at Hopkins. He was the chair of psychiatry and the psychiatrist in chief back when the sex reassignment clinic was shut down. This is an essay that he had written about Bruce Jenner after the 2020 interview. He says, transgendered men do not become women, nor do transgendered women become men. All become feminized men or masculinized women, counterfeits and impersonators of the sex with which they identify. And in that lies their problematic future. When the tumult and shouting dies, it proves not easy nor wise to live in a counterfeit sexual garb. The most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people, extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgendered, documents their lifelong mental unrest. 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who had undergone sex reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers. This is what Dr. McHugh was getting at in the 70s when he suggested that Hopkins wasn't adequately treating people who were experiencing gender dysphoria. And that's why he recommended that they shut down the sex reassignment clinic. And his point here is that it's not simply that people stigmatize people who identify as transgender. And one takeaway from this lecture should be none of us should do that. Because part of their problem is that people will stigmatize them and will belittle them and will marginalize them. And so we want to be careful not to contribute to that. But even apart from that, as McHugh points out, that it's very difficult. It proves neither easy nor wise to live as if the opposite sex. That attempting to do the impossible is what frequently brings about the less than ideal outcomes. Don't just take my word or Dr. McHugh's word. Let me show you some of the literature reviews on this. So in the next slide, this comes from The Guardian. This is a newspaper in the UK. It's from 2004. So 14 years ago, The Guardian asked Birmingham universities, their aggressive research intelligence facilities, so kind of a think tank inside of the university, to do a literature review of over 100 follow-up studies of people who have had sex reassignment procedures. This is how The Guardian reported on that study. ARIF, which conducts reviews of healthcare treatments for the NHS, concludes that none of the studies provides conclusive evidence that gender reassignment is beneficial for patients. It found that most research was poorly designed, which skewed the results in favor of physically changing sex. There was no evaluation of whether other treatments, such as long-term counseling, might help transsexuals, or whether their gender confusion might lessen over time. All right, and you can say, all right, well, that was 2004. Maybe we've gotten better at doing this. So let me give you a literature review from just 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago. So the next slide is from the Hayes Incorporation. Hayes is a consulting firm that does work for hospitals and healthcare plans on what procedures are safe to be practiced at their hospitals, to be included in their healthcare plans, and which ones are not. And so Hayes kind of is an independent consultant for hospitals. Statistically, this is the quote from their report. Statistically significant improvements have not been consistently demonstrated by multiple studies for most outcomes. Evidence regarding quality of life and function in male to female adults was very sparse. Evidence for less comprehensive measures of well-being in adult recipients of cross-sex hormone therapies was directly applicable to gender dysphoria patients, but was sparse and or conflicting. The study designs do not permit conclusions of causality, and studies generally had weaknesses associated with study execution as well. There were potentially long-term safety risks associated with hormone therapy, but none have been proven or conclusively ruled out. So in other words, we don't know. None of the studies consistently or rigorously show good outcomes. Some of them show bad outcomes. We don't know what the long-term health consequences are. And yet this is being promoted in the media as if it's a done deal, as if all of the research is in, all of the science is in, and it benefits patients. If you don't believe Hayes, maybe you say, look, they're a consulting firm, they're just trying to help health insurance companies not cover expensive therapies. Would you believe the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the last year of the Obama administration? So in the next slide, I have a quote from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services from June of 2016. This is from their proposed decision memo for gender dysphoria and gender reassignment surgery. You can find it at cms.gov. Based on a thorough review of the clinical evidence available at this time, there is not enough evidence to determine whether gender reassignment surgery improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with gender dysphoria. There were conflicting and inconsistent study results. Of the best designed results, some reported benefits while others reported harms. The quality and strength of evidence were low due to the mostly observational study designs with no comparison groups, potential confounding, and small sample sizes. Many studies that reported positive outcomes were exploratory type studies, case studies and case control with no confirmatory follow-up. So that was the proposed memo. In the next slide, you get the decision memo itself, which came out two months later in August of 2016. You have the whole hyperlink there. Overall, the quality and strength of evidence were low due to mostly observational study designs with no comparison groups, subjective endpoints, potential confounding, small sample sizes, lack of validated assessments tools, and considerable loss to follow-up. And unfortunately, that last phrase of considerable loss to follow-up could be pointing to people who took their own lives and are no longer available for follow-up. And then in the next slide from the final decision memo, of the 33 studies reviewed, published results were conflicting, some positive, others negative. Collectively, the evidence is inconclusive for the Medicare population. The majority of studies were non-longitudinal, meaning they're not testing throughout time. They're looking at a snapshot in an individual's life. Exploratory type studies, or did not include concurrent controls or testing prior to and after surgery. Several reported positive results, but the potential issues noted above reduced strength and confidence. After careful assessment, we identified 6 studies that could provide useful information. So imagine this, there are 6 studies out there that could provide potential information. And this is what we're basing an entire new therapeutic approach to treating gender dysphoria. But then the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid continue. Of these, the 4 best designed and conducted studies that assessed quality of life before and after surgery using validated psychometric studies did not demonstrate clinically significant changes or differences in psychometric test results after gender reassignment surgery. So take this from the Obama Department for the Center for Medicaid and Medicare. There's no actual evidence that sex reassignment surgery provides clinically significant improvements in the quality of life of people who are asking for these treatments. So we have people who are suffering. They're simply trying to do what would be best for them. They're not ideologues, they're not activists, they're experiencing something that none of us would want to experience. Imagine how debilitating your gender dysphoria would be if you would contemplate having surgery to change sexes. That's where these people find themselves, and this isn't the knowledge that they're being given. Right? They're being told by those 45 pediatric gender clinics that reassignment might be in their best interest. Which leads me to the next. This has been talking about adults. Not the next slide yet, if you can go back, sorry. Just the next part of the outline here is about children. So I just want to mention 3 things about the protocols for children, since obviously those 2 slides were addressed to adults. The first is puberty blocking drugs are not FDA approved for treating gender dysphoria. There are no laws that govern their usage. They're being used off-label, and it's entirely experimental. There's not a single random, representative, long-term study on what the outcomes are for children who are being treated with puberty-blocking drugs for gender dysphoria. It's entirely an experiment being conducted on these people. The second is that the activists promoting it say it's reversible, that you can block puberty, and then later, if you go off the puberty-blocking drugs, puberty will recommence, and therefore that's reversible. But going through puberty at age 18 doesn't reverse 8 years of blocking puberty. Right? The delay in puberty is irreversible, and we have no idea what it's like to miss your growth spurt, to not have your bones densen or lengthen or your muscles develop, to not have your organs develop, to have that artificially delayed for a decade. Again, it's experimental, and the claims that it's, quote, fully reversible make a mockery of developmental biology. The idea that even if it could recommence, and it's an if, even if it could recommence normally, delaying it is what's the irreversible part. And then lastly, it's self-fulfilling. I mentioned at the beginning that 80 to 95% of children with gender dysphoria naturally grow out of that condition and re-identify with their bodies. The Dutch clinic that pioneered the puberty blocking technique, in their clinical study of this, 100% of the children who were placed on puberty blocking drugs persisted in their transgender identity. So you're going from a world in which normally 80 to 95% grow out of it to a world in which 100% of the patients in the clinical study at the Dutch clinic persisted in their transgender identity. This has led some doctors to say that this is a somewhat self-fulfilling treatment protocol. That if you encourage a child to socially transition and then you block that child's natural development at puberty, you may actually be reinforcing and therefore locking in their transgender identity. That it may very well be going through puberty in a boy's body and the rush of testosterone that helps a boy with gender dysphoria more readily identify as a boy. And that by blocking puberty, you're actually blocking one of the developmental pathways that helps us consolidate and solidify our gender identity. Let me say, because I know we want to get to your questions, so let me say one word about people who have transitioned and then detransitioned. This is the chapter of the book that was hardest to write just because the stories are very saddening. They're just very tragic and heartbreaking. Because these are people who transitioned thinking that it would bring them the wholeness and the happiness that they were looking for. And then 5, 10, or 15 years later, they discover it didn't bring them that wholeness. And then they try to detransition and re-identify with their bodies. These stories complicate the sunny narrative that the mainstream media presents. Bruce Jenner got a 2020 2-hour special on Friday night during prime time. Walt Heyer has been ignored by the media. Walt is a man whose story I tell in the book. He's written several essays about his experience for me at Public Discourse. He transitioned as a middle-aged man, and then about a decade later, he detransitioned. He lived as a woman for a decade, and then he re-identified with his body and is now living as a man. And he's telling his story because, unfortunately, very few people have heard these stories. The stories of the people who transitioned as teenagers are particularly disturbing because many of them report feeling pressured into transitioning, as if it was their only option. That when they went to one of these pediatric gender clinics, the therapists simply promoted the idea of transitioning. They never discussed any of the other potential underlying causes for their gender identity conflicts, and never discussed any of the other potential solutions to their gender identity conflicts. Many of them now regret the damage they've done to their bodies, their lost fertility, and many of them say that people like me, and by extension, some people like you, are partly to blame. And so we should take this seriously as well, that many of them say it's social concern.
American girl is supposed to look like. And because we didn't fit those rigid expectations, that contributed to our gender dysphoria. So it should be a cause for our own introspection on what we can do to not have artificial expectations attached to how boys and girls ought to be. Because precisely when people don't fit into those stereotypes that they can feel the gender dysphoria, and then if they've been indoctrinated with the gender unicorn, and if they go to one of these clinics at Duke or University of California in San Francisco, they might have these procedures. So if we can skip two slides forward, so, and then the next one. I just want to read this one quote. I wanted to make a video previously so that folks can see that I'm a real live person, but didn't out of fear of showing my face. But I think it's important when we talk about these issues to really understand that women like us aren't just statistics, not just some dry data some gatekeeping doctor might throw at you. We're real people. This is a real outcome of transition. I'm a real live 22-year-old woman with a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow because I couldn't face the idea of growing up to be a woman. That's my reality. And so the challenge for all of us is, how do we prevent that from being the reality of future women? How do we prevent that from being the reality of other young people who are struggling with their gender identity? Because even in the best of cultures, navigating that development during junior high school and high school, navigating puberty is difficult for everyone. So imagine how much more difficult it is if you're experiencing gender dysphoria, if you're in an environment that has overly rigid gender role stereotypes, if you have an ideological doctor or a school counselor who's counseling you to transition. That's what prompted me to write this book. I mean, the short story here is this book does nothing to advance my career. This book does nothing to help me one day get tenure at a university. The only reason to do something like this is precisely to try to equip people with the knowledge they need to have conversations to help people. So let me close with 2 case studies. Chapter 6 of the book just goes through some of the clinical literature on case studies on children with gender dysphoria and how they were treated. And so let me just mention 2, because what many of the physicians suggest is they analogize between gender dysphoria and other types of dysphorias, other types of discomforts with one's body, other types of body image struggles. They analogize it to anorexia. And the appropriate therapeutic response isn't directed at the body, it's directed at the mind and at the feelings. You don't try to change the body of someone experiencing or suffering from anorexia. You try to help them feel comfortable in their own body. And so likewise, what Dr. McHugh was doing at Hopkins, what he still does, what he still recommends, what many others, actually the 2 examples I'm going to be mentioning to you tonight come from a clinic in Canada. They recommend talking to young children about why they think they're the opposite sex, to understand either what their fears are about living as the sex they actually are. So perhaps they think that there are certain expectations to being a real boy that they can't fulfill, or what their hopes are about being the opposite sex. Maybe there's something that they find attractive, and they think they can only do that thing if they are the opposite sex. Or maybe it's something else entirely. And the only way you'll discover it is by talking to the children, and not just accepting what they say at face value. So let me give you two examples. One involves a young boy who was identifying as a girl. His mother took him to see a clinician, and in the course of talk therapy, the therapist discovered that this boy was being bullied. The other boys at school were calling him a sissy. They were picking on him because he wasn't a very macho guy. Right? He was more sensitive. He was quieter. He was smaller. And so he's being picked on. And so as a result, he started forming friendships with the girls in his class. And then his interests were more stereotypically feminine. And his coping mechanism for being bullied and having female friends was to start identifying as a girl. It was how he was coping with this. So the doctor suggested three things. First, remove your son from this toxic situation. Your son's in a bad situation. That's one of the causes. Get him out of there. Second, continue bringing your son to me so we can have conversations about what a real boy is. So he doesn't have to think that he's not a real boy. We can talk to him to enlarge his understanding of gender and gender roles and gender expectations. Don't just listen to him with his narrow understanding. But then thirdly, we have to change his experiences as well. It's not enough that we talk to him and enlarge his thinking. He needs to actually have an experiential form of knowledge. And so the advice here was, you need to find your son a new play group. Find your son a new peer group. Find him other boys who are like him so he can directly experience that he is a real boy. That real boys can do all the things that he does. Real boys can be sensitive and thoughtful. They don't have to be jerks. And so a year after this course of treatment, their son was identifying as a son again. He was spared the hormones, the puberty blockers, a story like this. In another case, the therapy ended up not being directed at the child, but at the mother. So in this case, you have a child who was identifying as a girl. He's seeing, the mother takes him to see the clinician. The clinician's having conversations with the child, asking, why do you think you're a girl? And the child is saying things like, well, mommies are nicer to young girls than to boys. Mommies are nicer to daughters than they are to sons. He keeps saying things to that effect. And so the therapist eventually starts meeting one-on-one with the mother to find out, well, why does your son think mommies are nicer to daughters than to sons? And the clinician discovered that the mother had been date raped several years prior, and she had never received the healing she needed. She'd never received any professional help in processing her sexual assault. And as a result, she had developed an aversion towards men. And she was even inadvertently carrying out this aversion with respect to her son. Obviously, this wasn't intentional, but because of her traumatic experience that she had never received healing from, it was implicating her relationship with her son. And now her son wasn't, doing like a cost-benefit rational analysis of saying, well, if I identify as a girl, my mom will love me more. He was subconsciously picking up the fact that his mother was more affectionate with his sister. He wanted to have that affectionate relationship. He's now identifying as a girl. That was the root cause. So the therapist starts working one-on-one with the mother to help her process that trauma. Once she received the healing she needed, her son was able to identify as a boy again. And so again, avoiding a tragic outcome in a story like this. Unfortunately, Dr. McHugh, if he was to engage in those types of conversations in 7 states, he could lose his medical license. That's unfortunately where we are, how this discussion has been politicized, how we're unable to have just an honest discussion about these things. So let me wrap up. It's exactly 7. We started a little late and I went a little long, but we can do like 10 or 15 minutes of questions, and then afterwards I'll sign books and can chat for a little bit. I have to do a radio interview a little after 8, so I have to leave a little bit before that. But the floor is open. I think we're going to do a microphone so that people who are live streaming or people who watch this one day on YouTube can hear your questions as well. So just make sure your question is a question that ends with a question mark.
Just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. And make sure you hold the mic close to your mouth as well.
Thanks, Ryan, for your wonderful talk and for all your work. My question is, it sounds like the state of the science as far as the quality of studies is pretty poor.
Yes.
What is the likelihood that we are going to get high quality studies with appropriate control groups if the standard of care is being defined as transition therapy?
Unfortunately, I mean, I think it's unlikely because the people who are conducting the studies on these issues frequently have a vested interest in the outcome. So the places where many of these studies are being conducted are the same places that are transitioning children. And so there's somewhat of a there's a self-selection factor of who it is that wants to be studying these questions, and then what their hoped for outcome would be. Unfortunately, in the acknowledgments of the book, I named several people by name who helped me. Obviously, I have a PhD in philosophy, and so I needed help from biologists and from psychiatrists and psychologists. And I mentioned some of them by name. The vast majority of them I couldn't mention by name. They were afraid they would lose their jobs. And several of them can't even publish anything on these issues for fear that they would lose their jobs. That's unfortunately how bad it is in the academy right now.
Ryan, two questions. One is, to what extent is same-sex attraction a motivating factor in any of this and people's trying to deal with that or inability to deal with that? And the second is, have you had any conversations with trans people just talking about this? It's not activists so much, but...
Yeah. So to your first question, it appears to play a role. And so in one of the slides that we skipped over, and in, I think it's the 3rd chapter of the book, one of the women who transition and then detransition says that, if you're a young girl experiencing same-sex attractions, being a lesbian, because of the stigma attached to that, you might try to convince yourself that you're a boy or think that you're a boy. And so sometimes it's and there is a higher correlation between people with same-sex attractions and people with gender dysphoria. Dr. McHugh points out that for adult men, there are two, or at least there were, two leading theories about this. One was autogynephilia, and one was kind of like a repressed homosexuality. And so the autogynephilia, and this is what Dr. McHugh suggests that Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner, may be. Autogynephilia stands for love of self as woman. If you take the three kind of Greek roots there. Auto being self, gyne being female, and then philia being love. And McHugh, from his clinical experience, and then when he saw the Vanity Fair cover shoot of Jenner, says that this fits many of the patients that presented themselves of men who wanted to become the type of woman that they and they think others are attracted to. So it's like a autogynephilia, love of self as in the guise of, or in the identity of a woman. Then for other people, it's kind of a internalized homophobia almost. Because I'm attracted to other men, it would actually be better as a coping mechanism to identify as a woman, because then my relationship with men will be socially approved of. And so one of the arguments now being made is that we'll see less of that because of the redefinition of marriage, because of the acceptability of being a gay man or a lesbian woman, that strand of the cause of gender dysphoria may go away. The answer to your second question is, I've had several conversations without people knowing that I was working on the book, and I didn't quote anyone. I'm now being criticized by people. You don't quote any trans people. I wasn't doing this. Wasn't like a journalistic reported book. But I've actually had dinner with rather famous trans people who are making headlines as we speak. One of whom was actually criticizing the book, I think not realizing that it's me at dinner. I mean, partly because there's this ridiculous New York Times op-ed that posted earlier this afternoon from someone who obviously didn't read the book and was going off of a book review that got lots of facts about the book wrong, and then just repeats and parrots those things in the op-ed. And so, yeah, I would hate that book too if it existed, but it doesn't exist. That's not the book I wrote. So it's understandable why people who think that that's the book I wrote are criticizing it. Right? I would criticize such a book too. But in general, what was fascinating to me was that several of these people were Trump supporters. They were critics of the LGBT activists. They said they don't speak for them or people like them. They just want to be free to be who they are, as they understand it. And they didn't buy into any of the political correct stuff. It was actually really fascinating. But no, I don't want to actually name names or anything, partly because this wasn't meant to be like an on-the-record encounter. It was meant to just be getting to know people.
Thank you so much for your work. I guess my question is twofold also.
Sure.
One, in this age of science, if that's what we're in, this age of I'm fighting for science and facts, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we are fighting so hard for something that is really fluid and conflicting? And secondly, I have a cousin transitioning into female, and I just don't know how to approach
Yeah,
this.
great questions. So on the first one, I think partly because this got this got latched on to part of identity politics and part of LGBT activism in general. So for many people, they've never actually thought about the T part of the acronym, but they know that they're an ally, that they're in favor of gay rights, that they're in favor of what they call marriage equality. And so as soon as that discussion was over and the Supreme Court voted to redefine marriage, all of that attention, all that activism, all those organizations and their well-funded bank accounts got redirected towards the T. And so many people, including politicians, were, look, I'm an LGBT ally, so this is the next thing, full steam ahead. And they haven't stopped to even think about what it means when you're putting a 10-year-old boy on puberty-blocking drugs, or what it means when you're giving a 16-year-old girl testosterone therapy. And I think many of them, if they did stop and think about this, would have the types of reactions that many of you are having. Let's not rush into this. Let's urge caution. Which leads to the answer to your second question. The most important thing you can do is maintain your relationship, because you are useless to your cousin if that relationship dies, if that relationship is broken, if that relationship is damaged. And so when you hear stories of families who reject family members, that's the exact wrong thing to do. Your cousin needs to know that you, I don't know if it's a him or a she, but that you love your cousin. Right? Your cousin needs to know that you care for them, that you love them, and that you're there for them for the long haul. And so part of what this means is that you might want to, at some point, express your reservations, your doubts, say, look, have you considered these things? But you don't have to express that every time you're interacting. You don't have to litigate a debate or kind of represent your objection. If your cousin knows what you think, at a certain point you have to let your cousin make his or her own choices and let your cousin know that you're going to be there. And if 5, 10, 15 years from now they're coming to regret it, that they have someone to talk to. And that throughout that time, you didn't turn your back on them, you didn't reject them. Even though you tried doing your best to present your perspective on this. It's very difficult. Right? It's, what I'm saying sounds abstract, but it's really case dependent. It depends on the nature of your relationship and how close you are and how often you see each other and all that.
Thanks so much for your talk. I thought it was great on a number of levels and was very compassionate and without free of snark, which was probably hard to do. But I did notice you talked about gender. You made reference to how gender rose as a concept, but then you choose to continue to use it, and I think that's an interesting choice. There's an argument against that. And
let me say more about this. Yeah, so I think there is a proper understanding of gender, and it can be distinguished from sex. So sex is a bodily reality. Right? We have a sexed body as male or female. Gender is how we give expression to that sexed body, to our sexual identity. And you can get gender wrong. You can get gender wrong in at least 2 different ways. You can deny that there are differences between men and women and try to create an androgynous culture, or you can distort the differences. And historically, the cultures that distorted the differences, frequently it was a form of men are better than women, or men have greater abilities than women, right? So you can distort differences between male and female. You can deny differences between male and female. And then Aristotle teaches that virtue is the mean between 2 extremes. So if the extreme is distortion and the extreme is denial. We want to see a vision of gender that acknowledges like the fundamental equality of men and women, while also celebrating the differences that make a difference. And so in how we present ourselves as male or female, with respect to friendships, with respect to courtships, dating relationships, marital relationships, parenting relationships, that's where our sex bodies matter most. It doesn't make much of a difference in terms of who goes to law school and who goes to medical school and who goes to business school. Men and women can do both of those things. They should be free to do all of those things. And if it turns out that on average and for the most part, men and women have different preferences, viva la difference, right? Let people live according to their preferences there. But where our sexual complementarity matters most is precisely our capacity to unite as one flesh, to create new life, to then raise new life with a mother and a father. And so how we structure our society in terms of like the rites of passage, the norms that govern dating relationships, that govern male-female interaction as friends and as potential lovers, and then as lovers, and then as colleagues, all of that is gender. Right? None of that's just a biological given. Right? That's all stuff that a culture has to cultivate. And so cultures can cultivate our sex nature inappropriately, or it can cultivate it appropriately. And so it's chapter 7 of the book just goes through how to think about gender. And it goes through, the first part of the chapter is just gender theory. First wave feminists, second wave feminists. The second wave feminists are the ones who frequently deny that there are any differences, right? At the end of the day, they're looking at an androgyny project. The first wave feminists were much more of a men and women are equal in dignity, different and complementary in gifts. These are people like Susan B. Anthony. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. You may disagree, so we can chat more, and hopefully some of the book will be helpful. We have time for one more?
That's all we have time for. But I know we have more questions, so I'm sure
I'll take my place
you
back
could
there.
take some questions outside, or you could purchase the book, and it'll probably address your questions as well. Again, my name is Rosemary Hull, and I want to thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's discussion with Ryan Anderson. We're able to host such great speakers and start meaningful conversations around issues just like this one, facing everyday Catholics, because of your continued presence and support, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Ryan for having the courage to not only write this book, this important book, but to publish it and to speak on it throughout the country. This is a very sensitive topic, and Ryan has approached it with the utmost grace and charity. So please, if you read the book, write a review on Amazon or publish something elsewhere. And if you love tonight's event, I encourage you to visit our website at cicdc.org and check out our amazing event lineup. Stephanie Gray will speak on March 15th about her experience speaking at Google and offer her best advice and tips for speaking to individuals who don't identify as pro-life. The following week, Stephen Barr will join us to talk about the Society of Catholic Scientists and discuss the relationship between science and the Catholic faith. I invite you to stay for our reception that will go until 8 p.m. Ryan will be available to sign copies of his book right outside the chapel. And thank you again so much for coming. God bless.